Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do a long overdue horror and thriller wrap-up video talking about the books I've been reading recently. The reason this video has taken a while to actually get filmed and posted is the fact that I've been DNFing a lot of stabby books. And it's just the fact that I've really given myself a lot of permission to not finish books that I'm not enjoying. I do put a little bit more pressure on myself to finish books that are for my book club or things that are from publishers, but for the most part, if a book's not working for me and no one cares about my opinion, I will just move on to something that is working. So I do have some good recommendations in this video, but I gotta be honest, I also have some huge disappointments. I had some really anticipated releases and some of them really let me down. So let's get into it and spill some tea. First, let's talk about the biggest disappointment, and that is Such a Pretty Smile by Kristi DeMeester. And this is a story that is set in a town where there is this supernatural entity called the Cur that is going around and attacking and killing girls, and not just any girls, but specifically the women who just do not conform to society's norms. They are too outspoken or just do things that are a little bit more unconventional, and so they are targeted for that reason. The story is told over two timelines, and you slowly get to see the story unravel. And I will be honest, this book was such a huge disappointment. Now, for those of you that don't know, I love the author's original debut novel, Beneath, and I love that book because it was a feminist story that was cutting and dark and uncomfortable. And so I was expecting more of the same. And I will say that this new book from her is much more polished. It is put out by a larger press, and I do feel like in terms of editing, the narrative was much more cohesive. But I feel like in polishing the story, it lost some of the grit that I love so much about this author's work. So I will say that while I absolutely love the premise, you know, if you watch any of my end of the year videos, that I love feminist horror, I found this one to be really boring in execution. I just wasn't very invested, and I found myself just struggling to finish it. So while I love the author, I just felt like this execution fell really flat. I would love to know, for those of you that have read that, did you have a similar experience, or did it really work for you? Because I was incredibly let down. I thought this was going to be a 5-star read. I thought I'd be gushing about it at the end of the year. And yeah, that is not going to happen. Next, let's talk about Cannibal Creator by Lutzke. And this is a horror novella that is inspired by the classic Italian films of the age that were all centered around cannibalism. I understand that they involved a lot of harm to animals in the films. And so this story is really meant to be a reflection on that. It is a guilty pleasure of the author, and so he wanted to write his own story based around that. I will admit I have never watched any of these films, and because of that, I don't think I got as much out of this story as other people will. But I do tend to enjoy a good gruesome story, and I will say it delivered in that aspect. It definitely involves cannibalism and has some really gory scenes, but what I normally look for when I pick up a Lutzke book is the character work, particularly the emotional backing behind them, because I've read some really emotionally poignant books from him before, and given the subject matter, I should have expected this one to be different, but I will say that it just read like more of a slasher cannibal story, as you would expect, and it didn't have the character depth that I was looking for. So it didn't quite meet my own expectations because I was expecting something a little bit more unique. But if you go in looking for cannibals, you're gonna get cannibals. It's gonna be gory, and if that sounds great, then definitely go check it out for yourself. Next, let's talk about Echo by Olde Heuvelt, and this is a translated horror novel that I received from Tor Nightfire, the new horror publisher. And this is a story that centers around two men that go mountaineering. Right at the beginning of the story, we find out that there was a terrible accident and one of them has been severely injured. He is now in the hospital, and the other man is just watching from the outside as his friend is in this state. And then the story goes from there. It moves around over different timelines, talking about the past and then the present and then what happens from there. One thing that the marketing did not do, which I think is a huge disservice, is pointing out that this is a queer horror book. These men are not buddies, as a lot of the premise or synopsis have described them to be. Certainly they are friends, but they are more than friends. They are lovers, they are partners, they are gay. And I really think that that needs to be upped in the marketing, because if you know me, you know that I'm always on the lookout for queer horror, so I was very excited to have that piece to the story. I will say that the character work in this was really well done. I thought that the relationship between them was very poignant, very emotional. I expected this book to be more about the mountaineering. I thought it was going to be a cold weather horror book that I could recommend in a future video, but I was surprised that much of this book really does take place around the hospital, and it's much more of a slower build, much more of a character story than I would expect. And this is going from someone who has read his previous book, which I'll get to in a moment. I probably should have reordered how I filmed this video, but compared to his previous book Hex, this one is much slower paced. I think it's a little bit more mature. I do think that he shows a lot of growth as an author, and it's also very different. So if you did not like Hex but are interested in this one based off the premise, I definitely think you should check it out. Personally, I did find it to be a little bit too long. I found it a little bit strung out, and I didn't find myself as invested in the horror elements. I like the relationship between the two men, but I always say I'm more of a plot-driven reader rather than a character one, and the plot just moved a little bit too slowly for my taste. So I appreciate this book, but I didn't totally love it, and I would cautiously recommend it depending on your taste in books. Next, I better talk about my reread of Hex by Thomas Olde Heuvelt, and this is a book I previously read, but I wanted to reread it after receiving a review copy from Tor Nightfire with the beautiful new cover, which I absolutely love. This is actually one of the first adult horror novels I had ever read. It was one of the first reviews I've done on my channel, and one that has actually done really well. I think there just wasn't a lot of horror reviews out there at the time that I filmed it, and it was really interesting to revisit now that I've read a lot more horror. If you don't know, this is a story that is set in a small town where there is a witch whose mouth has been sewn shut in order to avoid her from being able to cast spells, and the town has to keep her identity, or existence rather, secret from the outside world. The story involves a group of teenagers who live in this town that really don't want to follow the rules, and they decide to expose the wolf, and they decide to expose the witch to the world and bring out her existence on social media. This book is one that I think a lot of people go into with the wrong expectations, and I did that myself. If you go back to my original review, I talk about this book being a creepy witch book, and I think I did a disservice to a lot of people who picked it up based off of that expectation. I don't know why I was saying that, because if anything, the witch in this book reads more like a victim, at least at the beginning, because she is tied down, she can't speak, and so she's very helpless, and the teenagers are mean to her. If anything, I think that this is a book that plays with a trope that I really like, where the people in the story are actually more terrifying and horrible than the monster themselves. And so if you like a book that is going to play with horror tropes, I think that this one is really smart. I enjoyed it. It's very ultra modern in terms of the writing style, which is unique considering that it's translated, so I'd be really curious to read the original text. Unfortunately, I don't speak Dutch, so I'm kind of out of luck. But it's one that I really appreciate. I do think that people who read a lot of horror will probably enjoy this one more than if someone is just getting into the genre and say wants to pick up a witch book. Again, I think that this book doesn't really give you a lot of witchy vibes, and it's much more a commentary on how terrible people are. The teenagers in this book are obnoxious, but they are purposely done that way. You want bad things to happen to them, and I personally enjoyed seeing the fallout. This book gets really bananas crazy by the end, and if that sounds like something you might enjoy, I definitely recommend trying it out for yourself. I really enjoyed this one, and it was really nice to reread it and see how my opinions have changed over the years. Now, speaking of rereads, I also reread Stranded by Bracken MacLeod, which I recently hauled, and this was the January pick for my horror patron book club, and so if you do want to go and check it out, I always have a link down below if you want to join us. This story is set in the Arctic, where we follow a fishing crew that has been stranded there, hence the title, and at the beginning of the story, strange things start to happen. They are all getting sick, they are running out of food, and just are not quite themselves. They go out to try to find help, help, and what they find changes everything. This is a book with a really big shift in the narrative partway through, and some people love it, some people hate it. I really liked it, and for me it took a book that was interesting but a little bit slow and made it really fascinating. I'll admit I didn't love it quite as much on reread, only because so much of the fun of this book is that aha moment when you have the curtain pulled back and you see what is going on and the story kind of changes directions. So again, not everyone loves it, and you kind of just have to try it for yourself because I can't really say more without spoiling it. But if you're interested in checking out this book, again, I really encourage you to consider joining my Patreon book club because I do spoilery discussions in the channels there. And so if you want to hear my spoilery thoughts, they're all written out for you to enjoy. So I will just tease you with that and move along. I will say that if you're wanting to join, we are reading The Winter People in February, and then we voted on The Fever Dream for March. So I'm excited for both of those. Next, I want to talk about The Prestige by Christopher Priest, and this is more of a thriller. It definitely has elements of speculative fiction in it. I don't want to say too much about it, but it's a book that gets classified in a lot of different genres for a lot of different reasons. The basic setup is that we follow two magicians back in the olden times. I'm blanking on the actual year, but back in the time they were hated rivals, and both of them had these tricks that they were trying to figure out how the other one performed them. And the story goes back and forth. It's told in letter format, or diary format rather, as they recount what happened. It's a book that is all about the atmosphere. It is so foreboding, it is slow paced, it is gothic in feel. Normally not the kind of book I would love so much. The reason I picked it up in the first place, because normally I steer clear of books that I don't think I'm going to like, is because this is a book that was turned into a movie, also called The Prestige, which I absolutely loved. And so I was really excited to find out that it was based off a book and to see the original material. I really enjoyed the lead up. I thought it was suspenseful. And again, I'm someone who always says I don't like gothic horror or gothic suspense, but this one really worked well for me. There were some slower parts, I'll admit. The middle section kind of dragged, but the beginning and the ending and the pieces were all there and they came together really nicely. Although I will admit that while I liked the ending to the book, I did think the movie version of the ending was stronger, and that's because it was darker. So unsurprisingly, I prefer the darker version of the story, but I still like the book. And so even though I knew where it was going and I knew the general ending to the story, I would encourage you that if you love the movie, definitely go check out the book. In some ways, I love the movie more, so if you have not yet watched the movie, I almost want to tell you to watch the movie and then read the book, but that's of course right up to you depending on your taste. Then I read A Flicker in the Dark by Stacy Willingham, and this is a thriller that follows a woman whose father was convicted of being a serial killer. Now she is an adult and is dealing with the aftermath of that, but also trying to move on. She has a fiance, she has a job, and is just trying to get on with her life. However, there appears to be a copycat of her father's killings, and that just brings up all the memories, and she has to kind of reevaluate everything that happened. This is a story that I will say is pretty predictable. I was able to guess who done it, although there was a pretty good red herring thrown in. So I will say that if you're someone who reads a lot of thrillers, you can probably guess what's going on. But despite that, I still really enjoyed the story. It's a newer release, and I just found it really entertaining and easy to fly through. It was well plotted, it was pretty fast paced, and I just enjoyed it. I don't think it brings anything new to the genre. I don't know if it's going to be an all-time favorite, probably not, but certainly if you just want an entertaining read, this is a great one to pick up. I do think it's one of the better new releases I've read this year, if I'm honest. And finally, we have Someone We Know by Shari Lapena, and this is another thriller. In this one, we follow a group of neighbors. In the neighborhood, a woman has gone missing. Her husband has reported her missing, although everyone else in the neighborhood just believes that she has run off and left him. We also follow a family in the neighborhood whose young son is very savvy with computers and is using his spare time to break into people's houses in order to break into their devices and read their emails and just hack into their computers. And he may come across something that is very incriminating. This is a story that was actually, again, really fun. It's very light in terms of a thriller. I didn't find it scary at all. Instead, it's more that juicy domestic thriller where you have a whole bunch of housewives that are all gossiping about their husbands and talking about each other, and it was just very easy to fly through. It's quite short. So in terms of predictability, I will say that It's one where you can probably sort of guess what's going to happen, but the author did a good job of switching who you're going to suspect at different points in time. So she kind of has a few main suspects, and you will go back and forth as the reader going, oh, it's obviously this one. Oh, it's obviously this person. And I like that while it wasn't a huge cast of characters, that shifting idea of who you're going to suspect made the story pretty fun. So I enjoyed it. I've never read this author before, so if you do have recommendations, because I know she has a pretty big backlist, I would love to hear if there's something else that you enjoyed by her. Again, I don't think this is a 5-star thriller by any means, but it was enjoyable. I had fun, and sometimes that's all I want from a book. So that is it for this video here. I would love to hear of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out? And also let me know what was the biggest disappointment of the year so far for you, whether it's a new release or something backlist that you were just really looking forward to. And also please recommend me one of the best books you've read so far this year, because I really need to turn around my horror and thriller reading. I have high hopes for this year, and I got off to a pretty bad start, if I'm honest. There was a lot of DNFs and a lot of 3-star reads and so forth. So if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy. You can help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online. You can drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoji, it all helps. And if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss another video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.